Hi everyone, thanks for coming to my presentation on a digital archive audit based on corpus use. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about some work in progress right behind me and work to come, and I hope very much to get your feedback on these questions. So let me start basically with a problem, and the problem involves digital language corpora, that they're very heterogeneous. They have many different forms, they contain many different items, they're structured in very different ways. Second part of the problem is that many of our digital standards were implicitly formalized 15 years or so ago before much recent digital work was possible. So we've been using digital media to record language corpora for quite some time now. For roughly between 2000 and 2005 was when the big changeover happened from mostly analog to pretty much entirely digital. And in the last 15 years, we've seen an explosion of the types of things that we can do with digital corpora, things that weren't even considered when these corpora and when these methods were being developed. Another issue that comes into this is that a lot of our linguistic training focuses on making material for archives, not working with material from archives. Of course, not all this is a generalization, but when we do field methods classes, for example, as linguists, a lot of what we're thinking about is primary language documentation and how that language documentation works as a corpus, and then that corpus goes somewhere. We spend less time thinking about the use of those corpus materials and how to get material out of those corpora for use subsequently. Okay, so we don't know basically whether our collections are as useful as they could be. So can we do better? And that's what this archive audit is about. Now, audit's maybe not the right term. I don't mean this is any sort of adversarial or checking up on people and so on. No, it's thinking about how to do things better, what we're doing right, what we should definitely continue to do, and whether we should change things. So just to summarize all of that, linguists can run on their laptops and run in the field analyses that would have required rooms of specialized equipment 20 or 30 years ago. It's now possible to do things with linguistic data that were unthought of when many of these documentation collections were originally created, both in terms of research and in terms of distributing and using language resources in reclamation, revitalization, and renewal. Okay, so these are things that we should be thinking about doing. Now, of course, others have talked about this as well. So Bird and Simons, for instance, talk about digital detritus and how we need archiving standards which are sensitive to corpus structure and use. So these problems have long been recognized. We should probably also think about differences between natively digital corpora and digitized corpora. So is it different if you originally wrote out the field notes in with pen and paper and then uploaded them versus things that were typed from the start? What different considerations do those sorts of things bring? Should we be thinking about our archives as the starting point or as the ending point? I also just want to make a point about data life cycles and how they often overlook the role of archives and long-term sustainable data use as part of a profile of material that comes into the archive and comes out of the archive. When I see work on data life cycles and there's material in the accompanying references, the archive is the end point. It's not the beginning point, and it's certainly not an intermediate point. And we see this, for instance, with diagrams like this one, which comes from my field methods book, where we do all of this linguistic things. We work with language users, speakers and signers. We monitor recordings and so on. We back things up. We process the data, and at the end, we send it to the archive, and nothing else happens from there, at least in the conception of what's going on. And so I blame myself as much as any for this. Blame is not the right term. And so what I'd like to do here is do an archival audit of materials from accessible corpora in archives, a selection from across the world, from lots of different digital archives, and look at the sorts of issues that come up when we try to use these corpora as inputs to language documentation or and research with communities rather than as the endpoint. Okay, this material is pending NSF funding at the moment, and the structures are currently in development, and I aim to conduct this over the next year or so. So you're getting the first talk about this project, and I'd very much welcome your feedback about the types of things we should be particularly thinking about as well. So I've mentioned the audit. We're also planning a what I've been calling an audit along to gather future information about archival practices by linguists in particular, as part of working with stakeholders of many different types in many different roles associated with archives on collaborative outcomes. So while I'm going to focus on the linguist component here, I see this very much as a broad project relevant to a large number of people and requiring input and requiring us to listen to a very large number of people as well. Okay, so what are the aims of this project? So basically the aims, as I've mentioned, are to think about current archival data work as inputs to research rather than as final outputs, and what sorts of things come up when we start to think about the data in that way. Okay, so for example, what current archiving practices facilitate or impede the use of digital corpora? What sort of additional cyber infrastructure tools are needed? Can we do what we want to do with the resources we have available, with the materials, with the tools and so on? Or are we limited in what would be most helpful for communities, what would be most exciting for communities and researchers by the sorts of things which we are currently able to do with our skill set or with the materials available to us? How do we build in community-oriented resources from the start? This is something I've been pushing for many years in thinking about research and thinking about research that combines more academic type questions with community questions and reclamation questions as well. So how do we make language users, stakeholders in language reclamation, revitalization, and language activism really part of the process from the start? And how can these corpora be sustainable as well? So what sorts of issues come up when we think about the moving into corpora, moving out of corpora, and how these things kind of work together? When we're starting to re-archive material, are there additional considerations that we need to think about? Okay, so that's all the setting the scene. In the next part of this talk, I'd like to talk a bit about the survey itself and the audit and the audit along and the types of questions that we want to ask here. We're conceiving of the survey plan as having 5 different parts to take roughly a year to work on. One way that we've had to limit this is to not do full work with each corpus that we want to work with and get to the end of each corpus, but rather we've set a time limit and said, in the time available and given the skills that we have so far, we should be able to do X, Y, and Z. And if we can't do X, Y, and Z, what sort of problems, what sort of issues have come up that prevent us from doing so? And then we can use that as the jumping off point to how to think about what sorts of changes should be made to archival practices and things like that. Okay, so I'm thinking of these 5 different points as taking roughly 2 months each, with me and others that I can work with, undergrad students, graduate students, hopefully a postdoc, again, pending funding and so on. The full questions that we're going to be asking, or the preliminary questions, I guess we would call them, that are going to delimit the scope of each of these areas are available in the open science format osf.io project that I've started. And so you're very welcome to see the full material there as well. But just briefly, we're thinking about, first of all, the format and the scope of the collections. For instance, is the metadata usable? Can we recover the information we need about the collection from the metadata that was recorded? Can we match up the metadata with the collections? We want to work with sound files. Can we, for instance, create forced aligned recordings from already transcribed material that was transcribed at the utterance level? Can we produce a phoneme inventory of the language with minimal additional processing? can we, I don't know, create a talking dictionary? What would it take to create a talking dictionary? These sorts of things. Working with print materials, what sorts of pre-processing is necessary in order to, for example, create the input to a part of speech tagged corpus? How much of the print materials are aligned with interlinear glosses? What format is there? All of those sorts of questions. I should mention that in thinking about this audit for corpus materials, we're not looking at the extent of the collection. Like, we're not doing language documentation by the numbers in terms of how many hours of recordings there are, how many words were elicited, et cetera, but rather we're looking at it from the point of view of, can we get information about particular things that linguists, communities, and others might be interested in from the collection? And that could be based on a 3-hour corpus collection, or it could be based on a 300-hour corpus collection. Okay, so we're going to work with sound files and print materials. Unfortunately, we felt for reasons of time that including video here would just add so many additional complexities that it wasn't feasible in the time available. That was unfortunate, but we had to limit it in some ways. Okay, so sound materials, print materials. Producing community-oriented language materials. How possible would it be for community members to take an archival collection like this and find out who are the community members who were involved and which materials did they contribute? What sort of conversational material is there? Would it be possible to make learners' materials, pedagogical materials, out of the materials in the collection? Things like that. And finally, we want to focus on sustainability as well. So what would it take to re-archive these materials in a format that was sustainable, that would then not have to recreate a whole bunch of additional things that that subsequent people using this archive might need to do. Our preliminary results so far. So as I mentioned, we haven't started the actual audit yet, but we've been working with collections, both sound files and text print files, for 15 years now. And so we have a lot of background information, intuitions, things that we've noticed in working with corpora over the years that provide an indication that something more systematic is needed. For example, I have a student, Sarah Babinski, who is currently writing her PhD dissertation on comparative phonetic corpus work, and some of the things that we've noticed in working with those files come up here. For instance, what sorts of material are archived? We've found surprisingly often that crucial settings files are not archived with the rest of the collection, and we could see this as part of the metadata involved in the collection. We've had issues with unlinked metadata or unexplained conventions, which means it's difficult to link parts of the collection to one another. We found empty transcripts. So for instance, we searched an archive for sound files which had accompanying ELAN transcripts, but the ELAN transcripts were empty, raising questions about whether that was an import error or whether the transcripts just hadn't been made yet. We found many structures for structured files. For instance, ELAN transcripts can be structured in many different ways. They produce highly structured data, but those structures are quite different. Conversely, we found databases archived in unstructured ways, such as Word docs, rather than the database that underlay them. And many differences in audio-digital formats, which have an have impact on what sorts of measurements we can take. So in conclusion, feedback for all of this is extremely welcome and much needed. Volunteers for corpora to test are very welcome. Please let us know what you'd like to test. Let us know what you'd like to be able to do with corpora and language materials, sorts of things we should investigate. And let us know about your experiences working with your own data or others' data. And finally, look for information about this project throughout the years. So I'd be very happy to take questions as part of the discussion question now. So thank you.